Welcome, my name's Alden Reed. You're watching Arcane Tablets. Thank you for joining me. So it's not late at night. Doesn't mean that I might not rant a little bit, but, you know. So, as I said in my video yesterday, I've got a lot of good stuff. And I'm trying to be more productive, you know. It's easy to get up there and, complain and rant and this and that. Not to say that it's not important sometimes, or maybe justified even. That might be strong. Understandable. Is anything really justified? But anyways. Now, as I've mentioned before in my introductory video, I'm going to be making more structured videos too. I've already made some pretty cool structured videos about color tribes. It's a little bit complicated. I don't love making those videos as much as just sitting here and talking to you. I really like the energy of just being here in front of you, especially just this rip and record, no cuts, no edits, no nothing. You just got me, and it's fine if I make a couple mistakes or this or that, but it's very authentic, it's very raw, it feels very true to me. Another problem is that they tend to be a little bit scripted, some of the other videos that I make, and I much prefer just talking off the cuff. And there's some good reasons why they should be scripted. I've got a lot of kind of complicated ideas that sort of fit together in sort of complicated ways, and showing charts and slides, and especially to the extent that there's often a visual component, particularly with color tribes. There are some good reasons for making more structured videos. And I'm going to play around probably with some more screen sharing too, which will really let me still kind of be here and talk to you, kind of in a little box in the corner. But at the same time, then we can kind of focus on some other things. However, I'm going to try and actually maybe wrap this up in less than 10 minutes because I want to share some really cool information that I have received. A popular term that you'll hear a lot of metaphysical or spiritual people say is you receive certain downloads and whatnot. I'm not in love with that term, partly because of the computer sort of mechanical aspect of it. I prefer just seeing. I mean, it's really something that's going on in your third eye, right? Some sight that you're receiving from the universe, from God, maybe from your guides, some combination there, and whatever. We can talk endlessly about the dynamics of that. A lot of that is so hidden beyond the veil. I don't know. I'm not sure that we'll ever know certain things, but I think we can know a lot. Anyways, though, I have maybe received some pretty wild information, seen some fascinating information. And I'll put this in the title, so I'm sorry it's taken me a couple of minutes to get here. But I'd like to talk about dimensions, which to me, I think more in terms of realms or kingdoms, right? So dimensions within reality. Now, there's obviously a lot of ideas out there talking about dimensions. In particular, what you mostly hear among certain members of the metaphysical spiritual community is the idea of the third and fourth and fifth dimensions, right? And that sort of has to do with, in theory, raising your vibration, sort of getting to a higher level of being, right? But it's more about, I guess you would say, the energy, the vibration, whatever. When I'm talking about dimensions, the information that I'm going to share with you right now has more to do with what I call realms or kingdoms. And I use all those terms interchangeably. I mean, it is a dimensional space, but it's more like a segmented off kind of space. Not that they can't interact with each other, but just that it's not about raising your vibration or getting to a different state of being sort of more or less within where you are, but more about actually going to an entirely different sort of plane, which still oftentimes operates in very similar ways to the plane that we're on, but oftentimes is a little bit different. And one of the main differences is that there's all these different kinds of beings and stuff, right? And we hear about all these different types of beings, whether you think about them in terms of being aliens or other entities or metaphysical beings, and I think there's a lot of different kinds of beings in the universe, so doesn't need to be all or nothing by any means. I think we can have a lot. There's plenty of room. It's a big universe, right? So, talking about dimensions or realms or kingdoms, as I like to say. Let me just drink a little water here. All right, so I'm going to do some more deep dives, but I just want to get into it. Basically, we are in the 9th dimension. That's the information that I'm receiving, which might kind of surprise you, right? I mean, you also hear about dimensions talked about in more general, conventional terms, right? The planes or spatial points of existence, right? The dot, the line, the plane, I don't know, time as being the 4th dimension, which is, sometimes has a little bit of an interesting overlap between some of the other ideas, some more metaphysical ideas about ascension and whatnot. But also just has its own thing. But again, we're not really talking about that. I'm just introducing dimensions as these ideas of spatial realms, which have oftentimes slightly different laws of physics and things going on there. They are similar to each other in that I sense or feel that there's a lot of overlap. So Earth, for example, exists in all of these different dimensions, but there's sort of a different version of it. It's not exactly the same, and there's potentially different kinds of beings there, but sort of the basic geographical idea of Earth is here, and that there are other dimensions which also exist in the universe or space where you can find, the same planet, but in different dimensions. They might just be populated by different beings, or not populated at all, or all that. I guess this is basically becoming sort of an introduction into my idea of dimensions or realms or kingdoms, which is probably good because I need to sort of differentiate that from some of the other ideas out there, the conventional terminology regarding dimensional planes, and then the sort of more metaphysical, often associated with New Age, which is a term that doesn't really mean anything that much anymore, but certainly, I just prefer spiritual and metaphysical community. I think that's perfectly fine. So anyways, let's just go over them. This is not a deep dive. Yeah, this video is going to be longer than 10 minutes. Sorry. I don't know. I'm getting pretty good at making them like 10, 11, 12 minutes. That's not bad. I feel like that's pretty good. Getting out a lot of information, right? And again, we'll make some more videos where we look at things in greater detail, and I'll talk about them in greater detail. And it's hard. It's hard to share. It's hard to even get to this point in the video, right, where I'm actually going to tell you the information, because as I've mentioned before in some of my other videos in my introduction, I have a lot of respect for knowledge and information production, and I'm very wary of how much misinformation and deception, and sometimes also just a lot of well-intentioned but maybe slightly inaccurate things there are out there. And that's why we generally, do a vetting process, right? You want to sort of see what other people are thinking or find information, pieces of evidence, right? Empirical, factual information. That's sort of what our academia, that's what the scholarly, intellectual community is built on. And I was very much raised and born and trained into that world. So, plus having Sagittarius rising, definitely have a lot of strong teacher archetypal energy, and can't wait to talk more about archetypes too. So, don't get mad at me if I'm wrong, I guess is what I'm saying. I'm just trying to do my best, and, I'm really not trying to mislead anyone, nor am I making these videos or any other videos because I simply want attention. I have these ideas and this information and these things that I've seen, and to a certain extent, it's kind of derailed the course of my life, derailed the course of my conventional life in terms of the trajectory of things going on, which is maybe not the worst thing in the world, looking at the way things are going in a conventional sense. It would be prudent to hope that there is some kind of magical, ascending brilliance coming soon, because Lord knows this world needs it, whether we're going someplace or heaven's coming to earth or whatever. We certainly could use a better space of existence and whatnot. So derailed only from the conventional perspective, right? But now I'm on this new track here, and I'm trying to do the thing where I, get out here and make the videos and share the information and tell y'all what's up. But yeah, I'm it's a fine line, right? I'm basically telling my audience, oh, don't take my word for it, but kind of take my word for it, I guess. I don't know. Do with it what you will. It's something you hear a lot of people say is if it doesn't feel right, then don't worry about it, I guess. But maybe this does feel right to you. And it is some pretty exciting stuff. And I have a lot of complicated ideas, and it interconnects to many other things, these dimensions, these realms, these kingdoms, right? Because they're all coded with the same universal energy signatures, which influence archetypes and astrology and color tribes and chakras and really just the whole divine universal blueprint. And this is why I will need to make some videos with more screen sharing and structure. I will continue with those because there's just sort of too much information and it's important to look at some stuff. But again, just connecting with you, getting out the basic ideas. So, I think given the kind of awesome and cool and interesting nature of this video, I can be forgiven for, taking a little bit longer to get there and just explain a couple things. But let me just go over the dimensions. And so there are 15 of them, right? Because there's 15 universal energy signatures. So they're each going to correspond to a universal energy signature. So I'm just going to go through them, say just one or two things about them, and then maybe just kind of go back over them a little bit because I'd like to lay them all out so you can sort of compare. And again, that's another reason why making some videos with some other visual components and screen sharing will be important. But here we are, talking about dimensions, realms, kingdoms, right? Okay. So the first dimension, or the first realm, the first kingdom, right, is the giant kingdom, the giant realm. And that's where beings are big. Flora and fauna is very big from there. Okay? Makes sense, right? Second dimension is the Dwarven realm. And there, all the flora and the fauna is a little bit smaller, wherever you are, whatever planet or world or area you are, right? In the third dimension, we have the Fey realm, or the fairy realm, or kingdom, right? And that's where fairies and all sorts of other sort of hybrid magical creatures and things come from, right? The fourth dimension is the aquatic realm. Drink a little water in honor of that. And that's where fish-like aquatic humanoid beings are from, right? And you know what I mean when I say a humanoid being that is from one of these animal kingdoms, right? You've seen a lot of art about various extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional beings. Or you've watched a lot of, everyone knows what like a cat person or a lizard person or a fish person is, right? Talking about, generally speaking, beings that are also more or less having a humanoid shape, right? The sort of star shape that is classically associated with humans, but having animal features, right? Having an animal head or other types of animal features. And they don't always have the classic star point design, I should say. There are many highly intelligent and evolved beings all throughout the universe that don't necessarily have that. However, the star model, even for animal kingdom humanoid beings, is predominant. So certainly the majority of beings in the universe do follow this star humanoid pattern. Okay? So just to explain that. So now when we're talking about the next couple realms or kingdoms, we're going through the animal kingdoms, right? So fourth dimension is aquatic. So just to keep them in mind, right? So giant, dwarven, fairy, or fey, and then the aquatic dimension with aquatic humanoid beings, right? Then the fifth dimension is the reptilian dimension. And that's where you're going to find all these reptilian-like humanoid beings, right? The sixth dimension is the insect dimension, or the insectoid dimension, or realm, or kingdom. And that's where you're going to find a lot of insect-like humanoid beings. The seventh dimension is the avian realm. And that's where you're going to find a lot of bird-like humanoid beings and their various kingdoms and whatnot. The eighth dimension is the mammalian realm. And that's where you're going to find all the other mammal-like humanoid beings, basically. The ninth dimension is the human humanoid realm, our realm. So, according to what I have seen or been shown, we actually live in the ninth dimension, or the ninth kingdom or realm. Okay? The 10th kingdom or realm is the Elven realm, also known as the Undying Lands. And that's where elves and a number of other different kind of beings come from too, right? The 11th and the 12th dimensions are a little bit different. They're a little bit more etheric, you would say. They're still somewhat physical, but they're mixed. They're not as dense as some of these other dimensions. There's more kind of magic and a lot of sort of more spiritual beings that exist there, right? So the 11th dimension is the shadow dimension or realm or kingdom, right? And then the 12th dimension is the light realm or kingdom. And these are where beings that are often traditionally called either daemons or angeli come from. And I do want to share that right off the bat. I prefer to generally call them light beings or shadow beings, right? Shadow beings in the 11th dimension, light beings in the 12th dimension. Now, technically speaking, you can still call them daemons or angels or angeli. For whatever reason, daemon and angeli, those are the words that come to me, okay? One of the reasons, though, that I do use light and shadow a lot is to just make a clear differentiation between the Abrahamic or Judeo-Christian ideas regarding demons, right? Because there's this concept of demons being fundamentally kind of bad or evil. And I have received a lot of information about the universe that is a lot more complicated than that. So the beings from the 11th dimension, these shadow beings, who were long ago called daemons, especially by the Greeks, right? They are not fundamentally evil beings. Nor are the light beings or the angeli fundamentally always perfectly good. It's a little bit more complicated than that. However, there is some truth to much of the spiritual and metaphysical information and many of the stories that we've received, right? And I can't really go into too much more detail right now. Each dimension sort of has its different kind of thing going on. The 11th and 12th are a little bit different, though, because they are more intensely aware of all the other dimensions, right? They're not exactly like governing or ruling, but they are sort of assisting, right? So light and shadow beings are partly metaphysical, and those realms are very metaphysical. If you were to be transported there, you would feel it is very different. Now, there are some different, more magical and etheric things going on in some of the other dimensions too, but a lot of them would feel more comfortable. Certainly the other animal kingdoms would feel more comfortable. And to a certain extent, also the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 10th dimensions, right? The giant, dwarven, fey, and elven dimensions, although they're a little bit more metaphysical as well. Another important thing to just kind of share, and God, yeah, I don't know. This is just what I've seen. So who knows? Is that there's a big difference between the 4th through the 9th dimensions and the other dimensions that I mentioned, right? So the 1st through the 3rd and the 10th, 11th, and 12th. And that is that the 4th through the 9th dimensions are where space exists. So the universe, the vast stretches of stars and planets and galaxies and all that, that only exists in the 4th through the 9th dimensions, right? So that's 4th, Aquatic, 5th, Reptilian, 6th, Insectoid, 7th, Avian, 8th, Mammalian, 9th, Humanoid, okay? So those 6 dimensions, that's where space and the galaxy are. And when I talked about there being sort of overlapping life on planets, that can be the case, right? Because the solar system, the universe, is the same more or less in each of these dimensions, although things can happen, right? Planets and stars and things can evolve and sort of change in different ways or be destroyed, I guess I should more explicitly say. But generally speaking, right, there's an Earth in all of those places. But there might be different beings on each of those different Earths. Or there might not be any life on some of those Earths as well. Okay? So the other dimensions, however, are actually really just different kingdoms or realms of Earth. So they do not exist in space, really. Now they still exist on like on a round planet, kind of floating in some etheric whatever, but it's not like the universe. It's not like where we are, okay? And you can only really directly access these other dimensions through Earth. And that's why giants, or titans as they are often called, and dwarves, and fey beings, and elves, as well as daemons and angeli, shadow and light beings, are often associated more specifically with Earth, right? Because it's like we've got these two sets of things going on, right? We've got all these galactic, extraterrestrial, also to a certain extent extra-dimensional beings, but then we have all these sort of more traditional magical beings that are more traditionally connected to just the Earth, right? And so there's a version of Earth where everyone is really big, or the beings and stuff are really big, right? I said that's the giant realm, the first dimension. And then, of course, the dwarven dimension. So that's where you're going to find a lot of smaller beings. And I should also mention it's not just like I'm naming them based on some of the more traditionally well-known beings associated with them. But if you go through the lexicon of various magical beings, you can sort of start to line them up more and understand. For example, you take some of the traditional beings, especially in fantasy and lore and whatnot. So in the first dimension, right, where everything's giant, so you have giants or titans, but then you also have ogres, right, and cyclops and other like big kind of beings like that. Whereas in the second dimension, you've got dwarves and small beings like that, but then you have like goblins and other small kind of traditional quote-unquote monster creatures, which I don't look at it that way exactly. I think it's a little bit more complicated. I take more of a World of Warcraft view towards non-human races where I don't consider them to necessarily be better or worse. I basically just told you that daemons are not fundamentally evil. Now, there's a lot of complexities to a lot of these things, which I can't go into right now. All I'm just saying is that things are a little bit more complicated. I should say a lot more complicated than the way it's often talked about, right? But so, again, getting back to the fey beings, right? So the third dimension, the fairy realm. So, and those are all just different versions of Earth, right? So there's no solar system, no planets, no nothing, right? Okay? There you'll also find trolls and gnomes and a lot of other little guys and stuff. So everything's not always perfectly obviously divided, you know. Sometimes there's a little bit of overlap, right? Whereas in the 10th dimension, or the Elven kingdom or realm, right, there you would find orcs and wraiths and some other beings like that. And what you'll see is that each of those beings sort of matches together, right? Right, giants and ogres, dwarves and goblins, fairies and trolls, and then elves and orcs, right? And they're all have similar sizes and kind of a similar energy, even though they're different in their own way. But again, the 10th and 11th and 12th dimensions, as I said, just different versions of Earth, right? So there's not a vast solar system of elven beings or a vast solar system of light or shadow beings or these other, no, they're just on Earth. In case you haven't figured this out yet, the Earth is the secret capital of the universe, actually, is what I should just say more directly. And that's why, of course, all these special sort of magical kingdoms are specifically attached to the physical Earth in its various different dimensions and realms. And so this is where so much of this information comes from, right? And the system that I've been shown about universal energy signatures and metaphysical correspondences is also a way to sort of integrate these traditions, right? The traditional sort of fairy tale metaphysical kingdoms with the space kind of humanoid extraterrestrial kingdoms. They all sort of work together, and Earth is sort of where everything comes together. So this is another reason why beings are hyper interested in Earth, right? So like angels and demons, right? Angeli or daemons, which I should use those terms to distinguish between some of the ideas associated with these traditional beings, right? They're only here on Earth, right? And same thing again with the elves and the dwarves and the fairies and the titans, giants, and all those other beings. Only here on Earth, okay? And the ninth dimension here, ninth dimensional Earth, or Terra, as its magical name is known, is where everything sort of connects and comes together. And that's another reason why there's all sorts of shenanigans that goes on Earth and have for a long time, whether it goes back to the days of Atlantean warlocks creating synthetic Merkabas, or to the modern times when we've got actors creating things like CERN and other stuff like that. A lot to do with all of this kind of stuff. And we'll talk about this stuff in the future. So that's the basic rundown. So I want to just go through it again one more time here. Just now that I've sort of situated you mentally, right? I kind of needed to explain a lot of this stuff just to get to the point where I can go through the rundown and it'll make a little bit more sense again. So first, giant. Second, dwarven. Third, fairy. And those are all just different kingdoms of Earth, right? Not existing in space, but just different versions of this world, okay? Now, when we get to the humanoid and the animal kingdoms, right, in space, in the galaxy, then we've got fourth, aquatic, fifth, reptilian, sixth, insectoid, seventh, avian, eighth, mammalian, ninth, humanoid, right? And these all, again, exist in space, in the solar system, in galaxy. You'll also notice that there is an obvious and logical progression here, right? Going from fish, right, to reptile, to insect, to bird, to mammal, to humanoid, right? That is sort of the general pattern that's laid out in a lot of evolutionary theory. And I have plenty of things to say about evolution. I will talk about that in the future. But for the time being, I'm just highlighting that there's a certain logic that is mirrored in that, okay? The rising from the from the fourth all the way to the ninth, right? Rising from the depths of the aquatic ocean realms, right? All the way up, finally to the ninth dimension with the other humanoid realms. And there's all sorts of other humanoid beings out there. I'm not going to go into them too much, humanoid extraterrestrial beings, but again, any being that is not obviously belonging to one of the 5 animal kingdoms, right? So an aquatic or a reptilian or a insectoid or avian or mammalian being is then a humanoid being, right? So when you talk about like the Zeta Greys, I'll just use that as an example because everybody knows about the Greys. I mean, there's a gray emoji on your cell phone at this point, right? Zetas are obviously not Earth humans, but they are humanoid beings, right? So they are native to the 9th dimension, this particular spatial realm. So you can get into a spaceship and not leave this realm or kingdom or dimension and fly to, you know, the Zeta homeworld or wherever they're from, right? Whereas if you wanted to go to the home worlds of some beings from some of those animal kingdoms, you would have to shift into a different dimensional or realm space entirely in order to get to them, right? So there's all these different layers and gates, and there's many different ways to go between dimensions and realms and realities I can't even get into right now, which says a lot because I love me some tangents, and I will definitely stop a video for several minutes to go off on a tangent. So if it's a tangent that's too complicated for me to get into, it's quite a tangent and worthy of its own video, very much. Now, there are 3 other dimensions that I haven't mentioned yet, and I'm actually glad that I didn't get to them right away because they are obviously extra special, and they correspond to the master energy signatures, which I've talked about, right, corresponding to black and silver and white, whereas all those other dimensions correspond to the color spectrum, the color wheel, and they have natural metaphysical correspondences with all sorts of other things and attributes and metaphysical systems imbued by the same universal energy signatures. I understand that might sound like a lot of gobbledygook if you haven't really been watching or not familiar with things yet, and there's just only so much information that I can give at once. So, you know, I'm trying to make some more videos, introductory videos, to kind of explain all the parts. It's a lot. I'll say it's very stressful, and it's one of the reasons that it's taken me so long to do this. Besides the whole, like, who am I to tell you how it is? kind of, you know, modesty and just concern for the truth and respect for not giving out false information, right? Besides that, it's just a lot. There's just so much. There's so many details. I've been shown all this information about the absolute amazing richness and depth of reality and the beautiful way in which everything is just woven together, in which God has created such a really remarkable sort of matrix which we can play in and experience reality, right? So the 13th and the 14th and the 0 dimensions, right, are special. Okay? And the 13th dimension corresponds more specifically with the Divine Father, the 14th with the Divine Mother, and the 0 dimension with the Demiurge, who is the being that is also often referred to as the devil. And again, that's also more complicated. I will say that there's a lot of truth to that, and in many ways, the Demiurge is the devil, very much the figure being talked about in Abrahamic tradition, the enemy, right? But it's a little bit more complicated. The Demiurge is also half the figure or the character that Plato talks about, this spiritual, artificial AI, which is probably a good analogy to use in these days, which God created as a reflection to sort of run and govern the universe. And the Gnostics kind of talk about this as well. And I do agree with a lot of what Plato and the Gnostics have to say, but I also have some slightly different information and some tweaks here and there. So, I don't look at this as a fallen or broken matrix per se. I just think that sometimes, like, a lot of bad stuff happens. Sometimes we sort of take different paths, and sometimes the forces of evil are somewhat successful. I think in the end of the day that good triumphs, but I can't even get into explaining my theory or understanding about sort of that, what's really happening in the universe. I think, as I've said before, ultimately it's just kind of a never-ending story, okay? So we exist to exist, and we're always going to exist. And we incarnate into these different dimensions, into different beings, to have different experiences and interact with different ways, right? With other beings, right? So much information, I know. We're just going for it here, though. We're going to give out some extra information. It's taken me long enough, so this video is going to be a little bit longer, but I want to keep dishing it out, all right? So the 13th and the 14th dimensions are really where sort of things are more governed, and that's separate. So those are more akin to a certain extent. You could say the afterlife. It's not really an afterlife. It's more just kind of a separate space that is a little bit more, or multiple separate spaces, two separate, in this case, the 13th and 14th, outside of everything going on, right? And it does have some qualities. They both do have certain qualities that are associated with, say, heaven or certain other magical, positive spiritual realms, for example, or nirvana, something like that. But they're not exactly the same. They're still a little bit different in their own way. And I should also mention, of course, that, as we might imagine, the 12th dimension is also very closely connected to heaven. So if you were to go to 12th dimensional Earth, it would feel a lot like the idea of heaven in Abrahamic religious tradition, right? A lot of the depictions. But that's also a little bit true of the 13th or the 14th. And the difference is that the 12th dimension, the angeli, they interact a lot more directly with all the other beings. And you can also incarnate and be born as a light being, as an angeli. Whereas the 13th and 14th beings aren't, 14th dimensions are not populated by their own sets of beings, right? Again, they're separate, special areas governed by the Divine Father and the Divine Mother for many different reasons that I can't even get into that tangent. Now, the 0 dimension, this is the void realm. And I'm going to explain this incredibly quickly. But basically, what you have to understand is that in order for the universe to exist, there must be positive, neutral, and negative energy. And that's where the idea of the divine trinity comes from, right? Okay? And why trinities are so important to so much metaphysical thinking, right? 3 is the magic number, as they say. Okay? The problem is that negative energy, and I'll make a separate video about this where I talk about this, so just, again, plowing through here, is so chaotic and destructive that only a very small amount of it can be allowed to freely mingle and interact with the rest of the universe, right? And so God had to segment off the rest of that negative energy to its own special space called the 0 dimension. And that also is because the 0 dimension is, in essence, from what everything was born, right? The primordial sort of cosmic void, right? Which then interacted with the primordial spiritual essence come together, positive and negative energy, right? Spiritual and physical energy coming together. And then they created a third kind of energy, neutral energy, which is really thought or consciousness, okay? Yeah, okay, well, I guess I am explaining some of the big picture ideas of the Trinity. I promise I'll make a separate video about that. But it's kind of, I just have to explain a little bit of the basic ideas here in order for this to really make sense, okay? And so the zero dimension, which again, it's only really in Earth. It's a different version of Earth, basically. But this is where all this heavily concentrated void energy exists. This leftover negative void energy, right? Which needs to be separated. And of course, that's a big theme that we see in all sorts of metaphysical traditions, in all sorts of fantasy literature and stories, is this idea of sort of the most dangerous and evil forces and elements within the universe being segmented off and separated into a special space, essentially being kind of imprisoned, right? Where they're not going to interfere too much with everything going on. But, as we all know, sometimes when you stare too deeply into the abyss stares back. Sometimes when you delve too deeply, you disturb things which should not be disturbed. And sometimes, after aeons of sleep, a great lidless eye, wreathed in flame, opens and sees the rest of the universe and thinks to himself, and it is a him. We'll talk more about that later too. Wouldn't it be great if I just ruled everything? Oh, there's a lot of people that love putting that eyeball on all of their stuff, right? Let me tell you something, though. Another piece of folk wisdom for you. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing you that he wasn't real. And so eventually what happens is that the Demiurge, who, when he is asleep, functions in a good way as this sort of regulating spiritual AI version of God, which just kind of keeps energy and things cycling. It's hard for me to even explain because it's just, I can sort of see what the Demiurge does when he's being good. But when he wakes up, he kind of loses it. And this is one of the reasons why everything is so wild and chaotic. And why everything has been so just kind of extra bad, especially in this planet, in this dimension, but also in other places as well. It's not just been Earth. Other places have been suffering greatly ever since this happened, right? So this is, though, the zero dimension, right? And the zero dimension is very much a place of cosmic horror. H.P. Lovecraft, if you're familiar with his work, some of the visual ideas and things, if you're wondering where all that comes from, that's down there. And this is another thing that I do need to explain right here, is that demons or daemons, shadow beings from the 11th dimension, often get conflated with void beings or void king, all right? Most of the quote-unquote demons or monsters or all sorts of tentacled madness that gets depicted in so much of our fantasy or science fiction literature is connected to the void realm and the void dimension. And it is the Demiurge, the ruler of that place, that is really associated with the devil, okay? Now, there have been a lot of complicated things that have happened in cosmic and galactic spiritual history, which I'll get to eventually. But the point is just that the 11th dimension beings, the shadow beings, are not fundamentally malevolent, okay? They, and the 12th dimensional beings, the light beings, actually do serve a function. Again, they don't govern things in the same way that the other master dimensions do in various different ways, but their more aware of things. Like I said, light beings and shadow beings are aware of their dimensions and their realities, but they're also aware of everyone else too, right? You often hear this idea of angels looking down from heaven, right? Looking down from their realm or kingdom or dimensional space. Because their function is to really help people be service to others in a positive way. Whereas the true function of the daemons, of the shadow beings, is to be service to self in a healthy and positive way. And especially in the metaphysical community or spiritual community, there's obviously a bit of a bias towards service to others, just as there is in the conventional religious or spiritual communities, right? This idea of the light beings, the angels, light this, light that, right? And it's not that that's necessarily bad or untrue, but too much light is not also necessarily a good thing either, okay? It's actually a balance is what we're looking for. And so the purpose of daemons and angeli, of shadow and light beings, is really to advise people in a healthy way on how to navigate material reality, right? So the light beings help you not take too much and give back, right? But the shadow beings help you not give too much of yourself and make sure that you are taking the things that you need, because there's nothing wrong with that, okay? It's really about balance, balancing service to self and balancing service to others. And when the Demiurge or the devil is asleep and the void realm is just simmering, things work pretty well. But when the Demiurge wakes up, kind of starts to infect the rest of the universe and all these realms and kingdoms with a lot of madness and wildness, right? So if things feel extra, and unless your eyes are wide shut, they certainly should be looking that way to you. Just know that we are in a dramatic sort of endgame point in this particular cycle of the story of the universe where a lot of this is coming to a head. We are trying to find and navigate ourselves to the best reality, the best sort of timeline, right, where we triumph, where we basically put the Demiurge back to sleep in the void realm, okay? And then that will cause a lot of the negative energy, a lot of the domineering and oppressive and chaotic and hyper-aggressive masculine energy to basically fade and recede. And that doesn't mean that everything will be perfect. It's not like that. But there is a reason why things are extra bad and chaotic and evil right now. Okay, it has to do with the Demiurge, the evil eye, basically, being awoken. And we'll talk more about how that went down, because that is super duper important and connects to some other rather well-known and sneaky personalities. I'm taking my time on when to introduce one particular personality. We'll get there. Don't worry. Anyways, that was the minimum amount of tangent time that I could possibly give you. And I'm sure, honestly, that I probably should have gone over some other stuff too. But whatever. I'm just going to keep making videos and keep cranking. And again, this is why I like this style. This is my issue with structured, scripted videos. And I will get back to some of them again. There is just so much information to share. But I do like to connect in this way because things just kind of come and flow in this natural way. So let's just go over all of the dimensions or realms or kingdoms one more time, right? So first dimension, giant. Second dimension, dwarven. Third dimension, fairy. Fourth dimension, aquatic. Fifth dimension, reptilian. Sixth dimension, insectoid. Seventh dimension, avian. Eighth dimension, mammalian. Ninth dimension, humanoid. 10th dimension, elven. 11th dimension, shadow. 12th dimension, light. And then 13th dimension, you could kind of think of as time. The 14th dimension is space to a certain extent. And that's not to say that they are, I don't know. There's still places you can go. They still do have a very loose amount of physicality or structure to them, right? just like the 0 dimension does, right? And the 0 dimension there is the void realm, right? So 13th, divine masculine, 14th, divine feminine, 0 dimension, void realm. We're all sort of the chaos and the negativity and the intense darkness that needs to be most of the time separated from the rest of the universe, right? You see, if all this negative energy was just allowed to just freely flow around, right? If the universe was actually, right now, the 14 dimensions, right, separate from the 0 dimension, if they were just literally a third negative energy, oh my God, it would be just so intense. Negative energy is really intense. Even a small amount of it is very, very intense, okay? And so most of it does need to be sort of kept separate. Now, the negative part about that, the other negative part about that is that it's super intense. And that's why H.P. Lovecraft and all of this 20th and 21st century sort of horror genre, all of that sort of fantasy and science fiction and stuff, that's all pertaining to the void realm, right? And again, as I mentioned, the majority of stuff that's out there which sort of labels itself as talking about demons or demonology or monsters or stuff like that, much more to do with void beings, void king, the void dimension. So it's the daemons or the shadow beings, a little bit different. They really are the brother beings to the light beings or the angeli being, okay? They're not fundamentally some kind of evil, chaotic force just tearing through the universe and whatnot, okay? When things are going well, they actually do serve a healthy function. And the void realm serves a healthy and essential function too. It's just when the Demiurge is awoken from his slumber that he gets up to all sorts of bad things and madness, right? Okay, I know. I could just talk forever, right? So as I mentioned, right. First, giant. Second, dwarven. Third, fairy. Fourth, aquatic. Fifth, reptilian. Sixth, insectoid. Seventh, avian. Eighth, mammalian. Ninth, humanoid. 10th, elven. 11th, shadow. 12th, light. 14th, time. 15th, space. And we could call the 0 dimension, we'll just call it the void realm, right? And again, the void realm is not the same as the primeval void. It is a separate space that's created after a lot of what made up the primeval void is then combined with positive spiritual energy to create also neutral mental energy, and then is actually used by God to create the divine blueprint and craft the universe and the structure of everything going on between it. But yeah, that's basically that's the rundown. And again, as I said, 1st through 3rd, and then 10th, 11th, and 12th, and then also the 13th, 14th, and 0 dimensions, right, only exist on Earth. They are different versions of Earth. Whereas the 4th through the 9th dimension, that's where space exists. That's where there are galaxies and stars and planets and all this other beings and all these various extraterrestrial beings. And again, if they're humanoid in different ways, different shapes and sizes like us, then they're other 9th dimensional beings for the most part, right? And if they're from one of the animal kingdoms, then they're associated with that particular animal kingdom dimension. I think we'll just leave it at that. I think we dished out quite a bit and made good on our promise yesterday to start making more positive videos where I'm not just riffing and ranting, but also sharing with you things the universe has shown me, things God has shown me. And just to put myself out there and battle against my academic Sagittarius rising, traditional Western empirical mindset of just, sharing information that is derived largely from intuition. You get it from some other places too. It's kind of complicated. I'll talk a little bit more about my own process and my own journey, how it is that I have come to receive information, how I have come to see certain things. in the future. But yeah, making good on my promise yesterday. Trying to clean my act up and just start cranking all these videos, right? So thank you for joining me. That's our brief rundown. And yeah, that's the brief version, trust me, of the 15th dimensions, the 15 spatial realms, kingdoms that make up our reality. And again, all of them correspond to with universal energy signatures. So we'll see each dimension has a corresponding astrological sign, archetype, chakra, and color tribe as well. And all of that fits together in a very complicated way. It's going to take me a lot of time to lay it out more. A mixture of these kinds of videos and also providing some more visual information and eventually getting out, my book, which I'm still working on. I've been writing it for a while. But the universe has been telling me, God has been saying, Alden, you just got to get going and just make these videos. You're actually a much better talker than writer. I think that I'm a pretty good writer too. I guess I'll let you be the judge of that. But yeah, I'm very good at just sitting here and talking and delving into things. And as I mentioned, I like the flow of it. It's very natural, organic. I like the way things come. So I get it though. I do have a very empirical mindset too. So I'm trying my best to also continue writing and then to make some other videos for the more empirically minded of you who like to see things laid out more clearly. And there'll be some more videos with that as well. Thank you so much. I love you so much. God loves you so very much as well. Many blessings. We'll see you again soon.